it over to her, she learnt all the words except testatrix, which she would always call testatrix. Mr Benson had been too much gratified and touched by her unconditional gift of all she had in the world to reject it, but he only held it in his hands as a deposit until he could find a safe investment befitting so small a sum. The little rearrangements of the household expenditure had not touched him as it had done the women. He was aware that meat dinners were not now everyday occurrences, but he preferred puddings and vegetables, and was glad of the exchange. He observed, too, that they all sat together in the kitchen in the evenings; but the kitchen, with the well-scoured dresser, the shining saucepans, the well-blacked grate, and whitened hearth, and the warmth which seemed to rise up from the very flags, and ruddily cheer the most distant corners, appeared a very cosy and charming sitting-room; and besides, it appeared but right that Sally, in her old age, should have the companionship of those with whom she had lived in love and faithfulness so many years. He only wished he could more frequently leave the solitary comfort of his study and join the kitchen party, where Sally sat as mistress in the chimney corner, knitting by firelight, and Miss Benson and Ruth, with the candle between them, stitched away at their work, while Leonard strewed the ample dresser with his slate and books. He did not mope and pine over his lessons; they were the one thing that took him out of himself. As yet his mother could teach him, though in some respects it was becoming a strain upon her acquirements and powers. Mr Benson saw this, but reserved his offers of help as long as he could, hoping that before his assistance became absolutely necessary, some mode of employment beyond that of occasional plain work might be laid open to Ruth. In spite of the communication they had occasionally had with Mr Farquhar, when he gave them the intelligence of his engagement to Jemima, it seemed like a glimpse into a world from which they were shut out. They wondered Miss Benson and Ruth did at least much about the details. Ruth sat over her sewing, fancying how all had taken place; and as soon as she had arranged the events which were going on among people and places once so familiar to her, she found some discrepancy, and set to afresh to picture the declaration of love and the yielding, blushing acceptance. For Mr Farquhar had told little beyond the mere fact that there was an engagement between himself and Jemima, which had existed for some time, but which had been kept secret until now, when it was acknowledged, sanctioned, and to be fulfilled as soon as he returned from an arrangement of family affairs in Scotland. This intelligence had been enough for Mr Benson, who was the only person Mr Farquhar saw, as Ruth always shrank from the post of opening the door, and Mr Benson was apt at recognising individual knocks, and always prompt to welcome Mr Farquhar. Miss Benson occasionally thought, and what she thought she was in the habit of saying, that Jemima might have come herself to announce such an event to old friends; but Mr Benson decidedly vindicated her from any charge of neglect, by expressing his strong conviction that to her they owed Mr Farquhar's calls, his all but outspoken offers of service, his quiet, steady interest in Leonard, and, moreover, repeating the conversation he had with her in the street, the first time they met after the disclosure, Mr Benson told his sister how glad he was to find that, with all the warmth of her impetuous disposition hurrying her on to rebellion against her father, she was now attaining to that just self-control which can distinguish between mere wishes and true reasons; that she could abstain from coming to see Ruth while she would do but little good, reserving herself for some great occasion or strong emergency. Ruth said nothing, but she yearned all the more in silence to see Jemima. In her recollection of that fearful interview with Mr Bradshaw, which haunted her yet, sleeping or waking, she was painfully conscious that she had not thanked Jemima for her generous, loving advocacy. It had passed unregarded at the time in intensity of agony, but now she recollected that by no word, or tone, or touch had she given any sign of gratitude. Mr Benson had never told her of his meeting with Jemima, so it seemed as if there were no hope of any future opportunity, for it is strange how two households, rent apart by some dissension, can go through life, their parallel existences running side by side, yet never touching each other, near neighbours as they are, habitual and familiar guests as they may have been. Ruth's only point of hope was Leonard. She was weary of looking for work and employment, which everywhere seemed held above her reach. She was not impatient of this, but she was very, very sorry. She felt within her such capability, and all ignored her, and passed her by on the other side. But she saw some progress in Leonard. Not that he could continue to have the happy development and genial ripening which other boys have, leaping from childhood to boyhood and thence to youth with glad bounds, and unconsciously enjoying every age. At present there was no harmony in Leonard's character. He was as full of thought and self-consciousness as many men, planning his actions long beforehand, so as to avoid what he dreaded, and what she could not yet give him strength to face, coward as she was herself, and shrinking from hard remarks. Yet Leonard was regaining some of his lost tenderness towards his mother. When they were alone, he would throw himself on her neck and smother her with kisses, without any apparent cause for such a passionate impulse. If any one was by, his manner was cold and reserved. The hopeful parts of his character were the determination evident in him to be a law unto himself, and the serious thought which he gave to the formation of this law. There was an inclination in him to reason, especially and principally with Mr Benson, on the great questions of ethics which the majority of the world have settled long ago. But I do not think he ever so argued with his mother. Her lovely patience and her humility was earning its reward, and from her quiet piety, bearing sweetly the denial of her wishes, the refusal of her begging, the disgrace in which she lay, while others less worthy were employed. This, which perplexed him, and almost angered him at first, called out his reverence at last, and what she said he took for his law with proud humility, and thus softly she was leading him up to God. His health was not strong. It was not likely to be. He moaned and talked in his sleep, and his appetite was still variable, part of which might be owing to his preference for the hardest lessons to any outdoor exercise. But this last unnatural symptom was vanishing before the assiduous kindness of Mr Farquhar, and the quiet but firm desire of his mother. Next to Ruth, Sally had perhaps the most influence over him, but he dearly loved both Mr and Miss Benson, although he was reserved on this, as on every point not purely intellectual. His was a hard childhood, and his mother felt that it was so. Children bear any moderate degree of poverty and privation cheerfully; but, in addition to a good deal of this, Leonard had to bear a sense of disgrace attaching to him, and to the creature he loved best. This it was that took out of him the buoyancy and natural gladness of youth, in a way which no scantiness of food or clothing, or want of any outward comfort, could ever have done. 2 years had passed away. 2 long, eventless years. Something was now going to happen which touched their hearts very nearly. though out of their sight and hearing.